Welcome to week 7, Region, Ethnicity, and Globalism. These are three things we've already talked about, kind of in one way, shape, or form, but we're going to kind of crystallize in some other direction, how these different sociological and political distinctions crystallize in some other areas of our current and our deep past history. So to start in the deep past, I want to take a little look at antiquity, at some of the early examples of early foods that developed, that some of which we're still very familiar with today, and others of which maybe we're not so familiar with. But it is fascinating to see how certain foods have a much older origin than we may previously have realized. It didn't take long. With systemic agriculture, was first more focused on vegetables and then fruits, but eventually there was the leap was made to grass species that produced what we would today call rice or wheat or barley or oats, what we today call the staples. So basically wheat-based products and rice-based products. So bread is actually very ancient. They have discovered old sort of desiccated bread that from thousands of years ago. Now they didn't necessarily have a leavening agent. A lot of the older breads were probably more like what we would today call pita bread. A bread that was cooked without yeast, so it didn't rise like the breads that we have today. But they've even found leavened bread, more typical to what we would today call bread. You find this in a lot of different cultures, but one of the earliest civilizations was, of course, the ancient Egyptian civilization. We do know a little bit about their foodstuffs because of they didn't mummify their food, but they often surrounded the mummies, who were often wealthy individuals who were subjected themselves to this process after their death so that they could ascend to the afterlife. And they were surrounded by things they would need in the afterlife, usually family heirlooms and treasures and things of that nature. But they would also sometimes have food that would be placed in their funereal chambers, and sometimes that food spoiled and rotted away, and who knows what it was. Sometimes it has been preserved for posterity. So we actually know a little bit about the ancient Egyptians for this very reason. But it was known that they were a very big bread-eating culture. It was known that they ate garlic. That garlic was something that they had discovered to use as that they cultivated and used it as a spice. And then they also made beer. And no matter where you go, you can usually find an alcoholic drink that extends back to the sort of almost the time of pre-recorded civilization. So technologies of fermentation pop up all over the world a very, very long time ago. Which is just kind of interesting, that almost no matter what culture on earth you were, you had discovered that if something could be fermented, it would lead to these properties of dulling of pain and loss of control and things that people apparently find pleasurable. It's debatable. I mean, it's not 100% known the degree to which the modern claim that the Jews that created the pyramids were kind of fed this almost like liquid breadish beer. It's just this very thick. It was almost like drinking bread that just happened to be alcoholic. It was a very thick beer that nourished them and also kept them knocked out at night so they wouldn't make trouble. It's not altogether known. That's not necessarily determined to be the 100% factually the case, but it is a very interesting prevailing theory that people that study Egyptologists have hypothesized about the workers who helped create the pyramids and the Jewish prisoners and everyone else, for that matter, all the other working classes. The Nile River was very transformative for Egypt, but there were other at least in the old world, the first major civilizations tended to grow up along major river systems. And we've talked about rivers and how that sort of itinerant flooding would help bring silt out into the agricultural lands. The Nile, of course, the Egyptian civilization, the Babylonian and Persian Empire, and today what we would call Iraq and Iran, particularly the area in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Yalu, or the Yellow, and the Indus rivers, the Yellow River in China. You could also throw the Yangtze River in China into that as well, and the Indus River in India. So rivers led to civilizations. Civilizations led to innovations in food, slowly but surely over time. Just some interesting foodstuffs from some of these early civilizations. The Jewish, the Hebrew civilization came up with some strict eating codes. At least the first that we know of that serve. I mean, eventually Islam and much later Seventh-day Adventism would come up with these sort of rigid eating code rules and regulations. But as far as having such a stringent set of very well defined Judaism, the Hebrew faith was the first. Also manna, which there's been much speculation about what the manna was that God provided for the Israelites as they were wandering Sinai after the Exodus from Egypt. But if you go even a little bit later in history, the ancient Greeks, they had their own food, regional food identities. It's one of the earliest known descriptions of what we would today call ice cream. Alexander the Great apparently loved ice cream. This was something that was established in some of the near contemporary writings that could have been told to somebody by someone who had met Alexander the Great. And what it was ice, snow taken from the mountains and hurried down to wherever his camp was, and then mixed with honey and berries. And that this was a favorite treat of his. So who screams for ice cream? Alexander the Great, apparently. And Alexander the Great was so transformative as a figure, and this is why he's so well known throughout history, and we still talk about him today, even though he lived 2,300 years ago. He spread Hellenic culture, which is the word for Greek. He spread Greek culture all over the ancient world, and in so doing, introduced some Greek food practices and traditions and recipes. Then, of course, we get to the Romans. The Romans were very, very famous for the creation of olive oil, which sort of helped drive their economy and was used for everything, including food. You hear about the Roman vomitoriums, where the Romans would, after feasting, would go to a special room, take ostrich feathers and put them down their throat to force themselves to gag so that they would throw up, and then they could go back and eat even more. That's played off in the Hunger Games, where I can't remember if it's in the first or second movie, where someone gives Katniss Everdeen potions that she can drink so that she can throw up and eat again. And Peeta Mellark says, "You throw up so you can eat again." And the guy says, "Yeah, how else would you taste every dish?" Without a hint of irony, talking to two people that, have been starving to death. That's probably fictitious. It's not necessarily proven. There are references to vomitoriums, but uh, it's felt like they may only refer to passageways that disgorged audiences after plays and after fights at the Roman Colosseum and arenas. The Romans had other interesting foodstuffs. Garum is like a spicy rotten fish condiment, basically. Um, Anise is an example of almost all cultures, ancient cultures in particular, had things that were supposedly viewed as having aphrodisiac qualities. Aphrodisiac is something that biologically, or I should say chemically, stimulates arousal in humans or animals. So it's something that you eat that puts you in the mood. Basically, most of these don't have much basis in fact, but certain foods throughout history. Today we talk about oysters as being an aphrodisiac. Um, at the time, the Romans thought that aniseeds boosted sexual desire, and so aniseeds were often, like chewed after a meal as a preparation for intercourse, shall we say? So the world of antiquity is kind of an interesting one in that there are certain things that are so different than licorice. We wouldn't think of a licorice jelly bean, which has the anise flavor, as being something that has those type of properties. Yet there are some things that are so similar. Uh, a culture's fascination with beer, a culture's fascination with ice cream. These are all things that are relatable. So the ancient world, the regional cuisine before the era of globalism was very similar today in some regards and very, very different in others. One aspect of ancient history, although it's a little bit more recent, is the Great Silk Road, which is more like, 13 to 700 years ago rather than 1500 years ago rather than thousands of years ago. The Great Silk Road was not a singular road, but it was a kind of a trade route that stretched all the way to the coastal China over near Japan, all the way to Venice, Italy, and therefore to really all of the European continent. And it wasn't like you went all the way from Venice to coastal China. For many people, they just had a route that only took them on a small piece of it. It wasn't a singular road, it was more a network of roads. And one reason why was there was a lot of fighting and wars and disease and famines and stuff like that. So, if this region of the country is engaging in a little bit of a war, then you take the more northerly route to get across. Well, if it's the reverse, then you take the more southerly. So the Great Silk Road was really more a Great Silk Network. It was so named because of one of the goods that went from east to west, which was silk, made from silkworms in China. However, the other aspect of the Great Silk Road that really made it work, people wouldn't have done this if they were just trading, minor foodstuffs. But silk was very highly valued for its kind of soft properties, particularly as a marker of status and wealth in Europe. So people were willing to go along this potentially dangerous road to find someone who had silk that you could trade with. Well, that was one driver of the economy. The other driver of the economy were spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, those types of things. Pepper and cinnamon were two of the biggies. Okay, salt was as well. And these were important for two reasons. Number one, again, it's a status thing. If I have cinnamon, I can put cinnamon on my table, and it's a it's like driving a BMW. Do you really need a BMW? No. Why do you have a BMW? Because they look good. Okay, you're sending a signal to people. Well, you're doing the same thing with having spices on your table when you invite them over. Uh, it's a status of wealth, tremendous wealth, for that matter. A lot of these people would get robbed of part of their spice. They'd go buy a bunch of spices and they'd lose a lot of it on the way back. It didn't matter. They knew that they were going to lose some of it. They could still make out like bandits, even with about half of what they had gone there to get. So it really drives the world economy. And like I said, it was rare for someone to go all the way to all the way. Usually it was more, I'm going to trade 100 miles down the road. So I'm going to take a trip 100 miles. It's still going to take 2 weeks. And I'm going to trade with that person because they've recently traded with someone else that's 100 miles away. And if you do that enough times, you get all the way to China. So one individual that did, it's controversial exactly what Marco Polo did. But certainly the Polos did some traveling. It was him and his uncle and his dad, maybe. He was just the younger man, so he was the one that lived long enough to publish his accounts, whether or not they're completely true or if they're fanciful. But, we still invoke him today, particularly if we're playing a game in the pool called Marco Polo. They just had a Netflix a couple of years ago series on Marco Polo. He captured the imagination of the West because he was, silk connected the East and the West. Cinnamon connected the East and the West, but no human had really done that until Marco Polo did. And, he was a merchant. He was someone who was trying to make money. He wasn't doing this to be a hero, but he became this kind of symbol of a global connectedness that brought new possibilities to the world. Now, famously, he brought back noodles, but that claim is a little unknown, shall we say. I think that claim was made a lot later, and maybe noodles were already had hit the West before his journey. No one knows 100% who it was that first figured out how to make noodles. It certainly wasn't the Italians. Pasta does not predate the Great Silk Road. The two prevailing theories are either China or sort of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Middle East, kind of in that area. Well, why does it matter kind of where it came from? It probably came from both of these locations. But it is interesting that it eventually makes its way to Italy for what we call pasta. It makes its way into Southeast Asia through, the southern part of China. Noodles get made out of wheat. They get made out of egg. They get made out of all sorts of different types of stuff. So we don't know the origin. We do know that noodles very quickly spread and were kind of adapted by all these other cultures. Including Central Europe. Stroganoff, uses noodles. So the reason I put noodles on here is an example of a kind of a murky origin that there very quickly explodes. And a lot of people are doing it, and they're all putting their own unique spin. Rice, another staple. Believe it or not, rice is more than corn. More rice is consumed than corn, despite all the corn, all the uses that we read about for corn. Well, one reason why is rice is more used in North America and Europe, and corn is, and rice is used more in Asia, and there's a lot more people living in Asia than there are in Europe and the United States. But that's just kind of an interesting little aspect of the history of rice, which definitely evolved in Asia. Asia or Southeast Asia, I think are the two theories. The Far East or Southeast Asia. And then I put curry on here too because curry is a really interesting one. in that what curry really just basically is a whole, you put together a whole bunch of spices to, in very tiny quantities to create this kind of extra um, strong taste. What was really interesting to me I spent 24 days in Thailand, and you very rapidly find out that curry is everyone home makes their own curry. Okay, you just don't buy it at the store. You often buy blends that you like, and then you add them together. And That was kind of fascinating to see that here we are in the 21st century, and curry is still very divergent. That what you have at one house will not necessarily be the same as you do at the next. And there's different types of curry. Each one have a level of. If you've never eaten curry, some are very spicy and very hot. Others are much milder. And finally, the really interesting thing about curry is when we talk about contact zones, we'll talk about Southeast Asia, and you get curry from the south, from India, and you get noodles from the north, from China. So, coming forward in history a little bit after the Great Silk Road, we get the Colombian Exchange, which largely happened from, the first 100 years after, probably the first 50 years after Columbus, quote unquote, discovered North America, or the Americas, should I say. You get this transition of different things. Well, first of all, they traded diseases. Okay, smallpox is brought to from the old world to the new world and just absolutely devastate some of the populations. And other diseases go the other direction. Biological contaminants like weeds, rats, animals, ideas. But one is foods. Believe it or not, potatoes, chili peppers, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate, peanuts, and maize, corn, all were originally in what we call the New World, the Americas. So before 1492, no European knew what a potato was. They'd never tried chocolate. They had no idea that corn was edible. They didn't even know about corn and peanuts. But the interesting thing is, if I say, what country do you associate potatoes with? Many of you would say Ireland. Name me a dish that uses chili peppers and peanuts. Pad Thai. Where is chocolate made? Currently, Africa. These peanuts appearing in pad Thai. These foods all rapidly get incorporated into regional cuisines on the other side of the ocean. Now, notice there's more variety in what the Europeans gained. Notice that you have wheat, rice, barley, oats. 4 staples going to the New World, and then coffee and sugarcane. Okay. Well, that's kind of interesting. That in one sense you're getting more staples coming one direction, and then the other you're getting a greater diversity of foods. And incidentally, we think of Europe as being just obsessed with coffee drinking, but even when I say that it came from the old world, it came from Africa, so it wasn't in Europe originally. By this time, it is, but so just keep in mind that even when you create this barrier of old world foods and new world foods, there were within the new world regional varieties and things that were missing, and the same thing in the old world as well. Incidentally, if you take rice and corn combined and add it's either tonnage or sales, I'm not sure. Corn, which is the third crop in the world, and number 2, rice, which is the second crop in the world. If you added them together, they would just barely equal the number 1 crop in the world, and that's sugarcane. to feed our sugar addictions. So the Columbian Exchange is named after Columbus. Columbian Exchange, Christopher Columbus, was this kind of, when it comes to food, was about this diversity of dishes, because people had been cooking the same thing with the same ingredients for time out of mind, thousands of years. But with increasing globalism, first you see this byplay between Africa and Europe, and then when Europe discovers North America, you see really it's a now a three-way trade. It's the Atlantic Triangle. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. So the Columbian Exchange is very, very interesting to read about and think about when it comes to food. During this age of exploration, particularly after the first couple hundred years, when things got settled, different empires kind of shook out who was going to control what. You have something called the Age of Sail, which is the 18th and 19th centuries. So we're just continuing to move throughout history. The Age of Sail was interesting because it really was a byproduct of globalism. It was about the globalization of the economy to the point that even though these sea voyages were still considered risky, people were willing to take them, because if you brought back a full cargo of, let's say, chili peppers, potatoes, and peanuts from the New World, you could make a lot of money. And if you went the other direction and went to Asia and brought back spices, even though they weren't worth as much as they were on the Great Silk Road, they're still worth quite a bit. So you see ships going out all over the place in order to conduct this trade and try to make a lot of money for their country, for their company, for their own pockets. You see this kind of early global trade. Still pretty, it's pretty small compared to what we do today. Okay, if you ever want to really understand global trade, go down to the port of Los Angeles or San Pedro, and just wait to see the traffic jam of trucks with these empty containers on the back, waiting to go back to China to be filled with cheap goods to bring to the United States, so that it can go to Walmart and you can buy a little plastic toy for 99 cents or whatever. So the Age of Sail brought its own challenges. It takes a long time to get across the ocean, so you needed food lasted if you possibly could. So they came up with different aspects of how you cure beef without having to cook it, and one way is corned beef. You put in big crystals of salt called corns, and that's why it's called corned beef. It has nothing to do with corn. It's corns of salt that get kind of worked into the meat to kind of help preserve it. Okay, so they take along corned beef, which would then maybe last for a while. They took along biscuits. You could make biscuits in such a way that they were unlikely to spoil. Number one, you cook them twice, so they're basically just this hard thing, and then you loosen them up in water, much like the graham crackers that we talked about. Tins, they started figuring out how to put things into tins and seal them, and then get the oxygen out of them, so you could like put a bunch of sardines in a tin, and then you could eat that halfway through the trip. Canning, making cans of peaches, or just kind of that type of thing. Canning technologies really came during this time period. They also used limes, and the reason why was sailors for a long time would get diseases, and they couldn't figure out why they were getting a disease, and it was a sort of like a skin disease that could get very, very serious. Well, it turns out it was actually a vitamin deficiency, and the limes just so happened to carry the vitamins that these sailors needed in order to survive. The British were the first to do this, and soon enough they were seen to be so very successful that everyone else was doing it. But at first they were derided as limeys, and that's why we still call British sailors limeys, because they were the first to figure out that if you drink lime juice, it's going to supplement whatever vitamin that you're losing, and that you will be able to maintain your health. The food on these trips wasn't good. It often spoiled, particularly with bread items. They really struggled with a tiny little insect called a weevil, until the point was reached that most people would just eat the food with weevil, not even think twice about it. Very small, but it was a little bit of a problem. There, a good captain, not a good captain, but a smart captain would want to spend just enough little. He wanted to spend a small amount on food so he could save money, but enough on food to get good enough quality food that his crew wouldn't mutiny, because mutinies were often about unhappiness with the captain, and that often was preceded by very bad food. Day 25 of eating weevils, day 35. So you can understand why some of these crews would, say to the captain, "You didn't do right by us. You cut too many corners." So the captains, it was a little bit of a dance. They wanted their food to be just good enough to prevent mutinies without having to pay huge amounts for it. But there were mutinies, and occasionally those mutinies, many of them did involve food. It was usually not the primary cause, but occasionally I've seen it listed as this mutiny that happened in 1687 was because of 6 weeks of spoiled food or something like that. The tropical islands were a place for outfitting, resupply, retrofitting. Not just for food, but they would cut down trees to make another sail if one had been damaged in a storm or something, and they often had a spare sail. But you needed wood constantly for planking and stuff like that. So a lot of these poor islands in the middle of the Pacific did get partially deforested, but they would also take food from these islands as well, including trading with the people who lived there. So tropical islands is kind of one of many examples in colonialism where a friendly indigenous local population is helping out these people who arrive on a ship, who then unwittingly through the disease or wittingly through chopping down their forest degrade their quality of life. So that was kind of an unfortunate aspect of the age of sail. Just a few things on warfare. Well, the first example I'll give is, I did put it last for a reason, so we'll talk about Sherman's March last. But warfare often brings with it the need to modify your foods somewhat because you're eating on the march, you're eating without, you don't have nearly enough food. You have to get what you can from the land to supplement. Warfare is, they say something about armies never march on an empty stomach, or maybe they do march on an empty stomach, but you've had famous generals throughout history talking about food and its relationship to how well soldiers do. Here's some examples. The Mongolians, were a horse culture. They conquered the steppes of Central Asia through their horsemanship. And one interesting byproduct of that is that they would drink horse's milk. They didn't have cows. And they could make many things out of the milk. They could just drink it straight. But one thing that they did is they fermented it for a while until kind of what was left over was this kind of alcoholic almost yogurt-like, kind of thickish, maybe kind of, kind of as it's going down your throat, you're almost eating it as much as you're drinking it, type thing. So kind of just think an alcoholic milk yogurt, and you'll understand. So they were reliant on their horse for everything, including their alcohol. Baguettes, it's a little controversial, but it's felt as some historians feel as if baguettes were a product of war as early or as late as 1920, towards the end of his life. And with the theory that, well, you'll just stuff one in your back pocket and the other in your back pocket, and you'll be fine. You're marching along. Baguettes are bulletproof. They're long and thin, so you can, if you have a coat or something, you can stuff them in there. You can break off, if you didn't eat part of it, you can stick it in your back pocket, and it will survive the wear and tear of a march because it's kind of crusty on the outside. So that's the theory behind baguettes, that they were innovated in a war within the last 100 years, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's the last 150 years. Hardtack, no one knows if it was invented for the U.S. Army, but it certainly became a staple of the U.S. Army. Hardtack was basically, if you take toast and you toast it to, number one, you take a piece of bread and you toast it to a crisp, and then maybe a while later you toast it again. Something almost like baguettes, and that it's like almost bulletproof. It's this really hard thing. Well, if you do that, it's unlikely to spoil anytime soon. Okay, you've cooked all the water out of it. All foods have a little bit of water in them, unless they've been freeze dried, and so there isn't as much to spoil with hardtack. Just think of it as twice cooked toast. So then, you have to soften it up a little bit. And, I mentioned something on the previous page that's kind of like this. And with the biscuits, it's a similar type of concept that, you just pour milk, or probably more to the point, water on this, and it softens it up a little bit. In the Old West, hardtack was very, very common. And what they would do is they would put a thing of beans on top of it. Well, if you do that, a few minutes later, the beans, the juice from the bean, the sauce from the beans is going to loosen up the bread just a little bit. Okay, so that's hardtack. And then here's just a few other random ones. The British certainly ate horses during World War I. Again, it's a thing of convenience. It's a thing that is a byproduct of Britain's attempt to see who is going to. The British have always prided themselves on, and the phrase is a stiff upper lip. That doesn't resonate with our culture. But we hang on. The British, we don't flinch. We don't. We didn't back down to Hitler. If we have to eat horse meat, we'll eat horse meat. If we have to do this, we'll do this. The British fought World War I to kind of see who was going to be the dominant force in Europe. They'd been the dominant force in Europe for the last 100 years. Really, I guess, boiled down, World War I was who's going to be the dominant force for the next 100 years. Well, it turns out it was neither Germany nor Great Britain. But, just the eating of the horse meat thing is something that serves two purposes for the British. Number one, hey, we really had it bad. You Americans don't know what it was. We really had it bad. But it also allows them bragging rights of kind of what we're willing to do in order to survive. And they did that, in World War I. Now, World War I, switching to World War II, World War I and World War II for the Americans saw two companies rise to absolute prominence. One was R.J. Reynolds and a few other companies that created cigarettes in World War I. They gave out hundreds of millions of cigarettes for free to the U.S. Army and Navy, saying that it was patriotic, and they may have been doing it for patriotic reasons, but really to create a whole generation of addicts. Because, these cigarette companies which were trying to break into the smoking market, which had largely been from pipes before, and maybe cigars were starting, had already been established. Well, now they have this little tiny thing called a cigarette with new ways of filtering and different chemicals that get put in there. And, they realized that these young men were going to be sitting around waiting for something to happen, nervous. War is wait, 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 wait. It's like 95% waiting and bored and 5% sheer terror. Well, these cigarette people were very, very smart, and that they realized that, what are people going to do when they're waiting to go into war for hours on end? They're going to be on edge. Well, cigarettes, had been marketed as this thing that kind of calms your nerves. And they did. It was successful. They created a whole generation of tobacco addicts. Well, the same thing kind of happens in World War II, but not with cigarettes because they're already established, but with Hershey chocolate bars. Now, Hershey did exist before that, okay, and had a following, had a pretty decent following, but this took Hershey into the stratosphere. Hershey also gave away a bunch of chocolate to the U.S. government, knowing that if you're just eating junk on the battlefront, even a simple chocolate bar is going to be heaven. And that these guys that are fighting the war are going to come back, these soldiers, they're going to come back and it's going to be their favorite chocolate. It's going to be their favorite chocolate. That's exactly what happened. I mean, Hershey went from being a big company to being a Titanic company because of their intelligence when it came to investing, basically. We're going to give a bunch of free stuff to all these millions of men. It's going to cost us a huge amount of money, but we'll get that money back in the long term, and they did. Just a little bit more about World War, about America at war. America, I think I talked about the rotten beef scandal, the formaldehyde beef. So by the time you get into the 20th century, the United States is beginning to move away from, I'm just going to buy a bunch of meat and ship it places to the war front. And they're starting to experiment with tinning and canning technologies to try to create foodstuffs that can be moved around very, very easily, that don't spoil nearly as quickly. And a product of that research was the K ration, so-called K-rat. And if you wonder why it's K, it's because they've gone through other series of the alphabet. And, it would be different. K-rats, you usually have, it would be this tin that you open up and then there's smaller tins inside. This is peas, and this is, some sort of meat product. You're not even 100% sure what it is, but it's brown, and if you heat it up, it's okay. And then, maybe a thing of peaches. They try to do a more of a balanced thing. And then there would usually be bubble gum, cigarettes, and a chocolate bar, and maybe a little thing of toilet paper. And maybe not all four of those. Maybe like I would get toilet paper and bubble gum. You would get chocolate and a cigarette, and people would trade. And so even though the food wasn't very good, people looked forward to the bubble gum. They looked forward to the chocolate. They were very happy about the toilet paper. And it kind of gave this whole, what did you get? Oh, I got peaches. Oh, I love peaches. You want to trade? It kind of made meals by these guys that were kind of, on the battlefront and, going through some really horrible, horrible stuff, getting shot at, seeing friends die. It kind of gave a moment of levity and hope almost, even though the food, everyone agreed the food wasn't all that good, you still got a chocolate bar maybe, or some bubble gum, maybe some baseball cards as well. Those would also sometimes appear there. And that was the K ration. It was very, 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 very omnipresent in the mid 20th century when America was at war. It eventually got replaced by the MRE in Vietnam, which is called the meal ready to eat. And the meal ready to eat is a sort of it's a very similar thing in many ways, but in this one you might have to add water and cook it, you start getting some stuff that it's broccoli, but you need to add water to it, warm water to it in order to get it to become broccoli that might even remotely become recognizable. And so that was the MRE. So warfare has always had a sort of relationship with food, and armies march on their stomachs, and kind of this whole concept. A couple of other aspects about food. There is often rationing during wartime on the home front. There certainly was during World War II. I own my mom's ration book, my grandparents' ration book, my uncle's ration book, my great-grandmother's ration book, all from World War II. They've been passed on throughout the family, and to me as the kind of the historian of the family. So you couldn't buy. We're seeing that today. This is the first food rationing probably since World War II, and it happens to be happening while we're watching. You can only buy one thing of spaghetti. You can only buy one thing of flour. You can only buy one thing of toilet paper. We're seeing rationing. It was a little bit different there. It wasn't like one per trip to the. You would get a certain ration of gas for a 3-month period, and of bread, and of milk, and of cheese, and of butter, and of meat. And then you'd have to make sure that it could last that long. Okay. So rationing is something that's done during wartime in order to try to kind of stretch the foodstuffs. You want to free up foodstuffs to send to the people that are fighting. So you try to stretch what it is that you get by, not eating big enough, smaller portions, starting your own garden. But that's, what you're going to get from the store, because you're going to go there and you're going to be given 3 months worth. Now, you can't do that with meat, obviously, or you could freeze it, I guess. Sometimes they would break it out. You don't just get it all at once, like you often would with flour and sugar. You could pull off a sub ticket and give it once a week to get all your meat. Okay. One final aspect of warfare, and I only put one example on here, although there's all sorts of examples, is using the deprivation of food as a weapon. Okay, so it could be either doing it to your own land, like the Russians did during World War II, or doing it to someone else's land, like William Tecumseh Sherman did to Georgia during the Civil War. In the first case, the partisans, these were farmers basically, would burn their farms and cut down their fruit trees a couple days before the Germans arrived, leave no food for them. And, a lot of these partisans ended up starving to death, but, they were going to burn their own infrastructure, burn their own agriculture, destroy their own agricultural fields so that the Nazis couldn't gain food, and then they would try to retreat and hopefully survive. So sometimes you burn your own stuff when you're being invaded. Or, like Sherman, you can, as did Sherman during his so-called Sherman's March, you burn your opponent's fields. You burn their silos filled with grain. You jail their farmers so they can't grow anything. It's an aggressive attempt to destroy their economy. Really, you're making war on their economy. Okay, and that's exactly what Sherman did. His army just went through a certain area of Georgia, this big valley, and destroyed everything. I mean, literally, they destroyed anything that could possibly create food for the Southern Army, and in so doing, helped shorten the war. Although, people starved to death. Was this a war crime? People have been debating that ever since. Just a few things about contact zones. I won't go into any of them in any tremendous detail, but there are certain regions of the world that, because they are kind of hubs of international trade, have developed really kind of rich and interesting cuisines that have markers of a lot of different areas of the world. One is Southeast Asia, which comes in between sort of China and East Asia and India and South Asia. And I've talked about this before. You have rice, noodles, and curry on the menu in Thai cuisine. In Vietnamese cuisine, you have a lot of Chinese, you have a lot of Southeastern Asian, and you even have some French because of the colonial element. Eastern Europe, there were so many tribes that just moved around, Germanic tribes, and then the Mongols came in. You'll find, for instance, they talk about Hungarian sausage, and when I was in Hungary a few years ago, there's sausages everywhere. I mean, different types. I mean, I had no idea what these were, but I mean, it was fascinating. You would walk into what I would consider the equivalent of a Stater Brothers or an Albertsons. The first thing you would often see is a sausage food cart that was like inside the building where they were serving fresh sausage. And then, that's not to say, once you got to the sausage section of the aisle, it was like 3 times as big as it would be here. But my understanding is these sausages are flavored. The sausages you get in Germany, which is just a couple hundred miles to the west, are more traditional European spices, whereas the spices that you get from Hungary are more from sort of like Central and Far Eastern Europe and Western Europe too. So Hungary is kind of with sausage being an example that I could use. The Mediterranean has had extensive trade. So you see, like Italian cuisine, for instance, combines. I've already talked about how in this region. Did I use that as an example? No, I don't think I did. So I talked about Italy as an example, getting it from various different places. The fact that pasta right now has noodles from either the Near East, the Middle East, or more than likely China, and tomato sauce. Tomatoes, of course, being from the New World. Garlic, which of course is from North Africa with the Egyptians and whatnot, and also red wine, which is more from Europe. And it's just kind of, there's something about the Mediterranean, which is this easily navigatable body of water, completely surrounded by different civilizations, with access to the Great Silk Road from its eastern Mediterranean, and with the outlet to the Atlantic Ocean, which takes you to the New World, which brought different foods and different ingredients from all over the world together. And as a consequence, you can eat baklava. I've eaten baklava in North Africa. I've eaten in Turkey, at the sort of the far eastern part of the Mediterranean. I've eaten it in Southern Europe and in Greece. And it's different in these three locations. It's much drier in Greece. It's much wetter. It's much more made much more honey in Turkey. So you kind of get the development of this cuisine that shares a lot, but with very distinct regional differences. So it's an interesting contact zone. And then finally, the Caribbean. As I mentioned, the Caribbean. When we talk about the Middle Passage, the three-way trade between really the Caribbean and South America and the southern colonies, basically from Charleston in South Carolina down to Brazil and then the Caribbean. Maybe Norfolk, Virginia. I don't think it was a huge slave disembarkation site like Charleston was. But if you basically take that region of the Americas, you take the west coast of Africa, where slaves were forcibly kidnapped and sold, and you take Europe, which is the economy driving this whole thing, it kind of creates a triangle. Okay, well, it wasn't just we associate slavery with that triangle and the Middle Passage, but there were a lot of other things that moved around in kind of that triangle, and one was food, ingredients, recipes, things of that nature. And so, like when you go to the Caribbean and let's say the island of Jamaica, and you eat Caribbean Jamaican, they call it jerk, Jerk, foods. You're getting chicken, jerk chicken, I think is the famous dish. The chicken is not indigenous to the Caribbean. Um, you know, you're getting spices from different locations. You're getting ingredients for different locations. The Caribbean is another one of these contact zones, unfortunately, because of the institution of slavery. But it did also kind of scramble the foods up and create new foods like oxtail soup, like jerk chicken, and some of the other cuisines of that um, region of the world. So these contact zones are very fascinating because they really do show you two things: uh, how regions react to the influx of global ingredients and global food traditions. And in almost all cases, you see that they manage to preserve certain regional food practices while encompassing new ingredients and new ideas. Um, Kind of fascinating stuff. There's also, I just want to talk a little bit about ethnicity. We've talked a lot about region and globalism this week, but we haven't talked a lot about ethnicity. Um, Food is part of ethnic identity, and there's when it comes to ethnicity and race, the, uh, there is a real dichotomy when it comes to quote unquote the melting pot in the United States. In one sense, melting pot is good. You want everyone in the United States to treat each other equally. If we had a true melting pot, there would be no more racism. Um, you want that. You desire that. That's the goal that unfortunately we haven't reached yet and probably never will. But that's kind of what you aspire to. However, if there's too much assimilation and too much melting, you lose ethnic identity that's been passed along for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You lose family, and I use Star Trek as an example of this. If you've ever watched Star Trek, the older Star Treks, had black characters and Asian characters, and but Star Trek lives in this kind of exists in this rosy world where there's no more racism and there's no more poverty. And I love Star Trek, but it's a little unrealistic. The older Star Treks, the newer ones, are much more realistic about human problems. Well, as a consequence, it's almost like some of these minority characters in the older Star Treks, particularly I'm talking about the original series and the Next Generation, are kind of devoid of a racial identity. You could be a black character and it doesn't seem to be an important, you live in a post-race world, so blackness loses its flavor and its value as a marker of identity. And that's unfortunate too. So complete assimilationism is not is also, you don't want to be completely walled off from each other, but you don't want to be completely isolationist as well. You want everyone to be equal and have equal opportunity, equal rights under the law, equal civil rights and human rights, but still maintain ethnic identity because that's part of your history, your heritage, and your culture. You see this play out a little bit with foods, particularly where you're going to find restaurants. Okay, because I can tell you where Little Ethiopia is near downtown Los Angeles. I can tell you where Little Tokyo is as well. Little Saigon. There's all these different. LA has these. You could sometimes tell. I think it's the is it the Korean, or is it more? I think it's Chinese actually. More Roland Heights. There's a Jewish area near there, and boy, when you cross over from one to the other, you can tell just by the restaurants that you're seeing, and it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So this is an example of non-assimilationism, yet at the same time, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, in one sense, it is too bad that different groups feel or get pushed into certain areas of Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or London or Berlin or Paris or wherever. Yet at the same time, it does allow for a little bit of ethnic solidarity to be around people that share your values and be able to walk to different stores to get different things that you need. So again, it's kind of, you know, the ethnic enclaves are kind of one of these push-pull things where you kind of want two different things, and they're kind of hard to get at the same time, you know. Little Odessa in New York, the Ukrainian, you can go there and go to Ukrainian restaurants because there's a lot of Ukrainian immigrants to New York City. Also, what's called the Borscht Belt, which is there's so many Russians in New York that not only do they have, you know, an ethnic enclave in New York City, there's actually an area in New York where a lot of Russian Jews migrated to after World War II. You know, Jews from Europe were coming and getting out, and some got kicked out. You know, even actually before World War II, during the communist purges, the Bolshevik Revolution, and a lot of these immigrants end up in an area, sort of north of New York City, you know, more what we call upstate New York. So you can't just call it Little Moscow because it's more a geographical area rather than a tiny piece of a city. And so they called it the Borscht Belt, which is a play on the Bible Belt, which is referencing the southern United States in its religious fervor. So I've always thought that's kind of clever to call it the Borscht Belt. Borscht, of course, being a type of Russian soup made out of beets. One of the most horrible things I've ever eaten, by the way. I really do not like beets, and I really don't like borscht. Little Havana in Miami, obviously from Cuban immigration to South Florida, and Dearborn, Michigan. And Dearborn, Michigan is the largest Muslim population in the United States, more so than LA, more so than New York City, surprisingly. Dearborn, Michigan, you're going to find, if you go there now, there's a lot of Middle Eastern restaurants, a lot of North African restaurants because of the very large Muslim population. So these ethnic enclaves are very, very interesting in that they represent a tension between we want to be amongst our people and we feel comfortable there and we're less likely to be discriminated against. Yet at the same time, we also want to assimilate as well. And I think food can be helpful in that transition, okay? Because as the food begins to kind of catch on in mainstream culture, it's a pretty weak introduction, but it is an introduction to this culture. And you might find people that are actually traveling across town to enter this ethnic enclave because their favorite, Little Saigon restaurant. Little Saigon, actually it says L.A., but is it in L.A. or is it in Orange County in Westminster? I'm not sure. Food has the opportunity to be consciousness raising for people that are not of a specific ethnicity, as long as they go to. Now, it doesn't mean it cures them of racism and they're going to open everyone with equal arms. Of course not. But just the mere fact that somebody would be, knowledgeable about and willing to patronize a restaurant that is in an ethnic enclave is at the very least a dialogue starter. Finally, just some localized dishes. These are more regional that I want to talk about. Key lime pie, South Florida. If you've ever had true key lime pie, it's not green, it's white. Okay, but they have these tiny little limes in South Florida that pack a pretty big punch. I mean, they may be small, but they got flavor, and it's actually pretty good. It's pretty tart. Okay, shouldn't surprise you too much as a lime, but you can now get it at the Cheesecake Factory. You can get it at But I remember when I was a kid, the first time I ever tried it was when I was in Florida, and my parents, we got to find a key lime pie place, because they'd only eaten it one time before in their life, and that was when they had been to Florida in 1967. Well before I was born. So you couldn't get it in California at that point. It wasn't something you could just go to a restaurant and order. You needed to be usually in the area. Or sometimes you would go to a restaurant and you would find out, hey, they have a key lime pie, and it was because the person that owned that restaurant had originally lived in South Florida and was willing to pay the huge amount of, pay to have it shipped. Okay. But see, now we live in a world where shipping is very easy. Amazon Prime, you can order anything in the world before the coronavirus, and it's on your doorstep in 2 days. But when I first tried key lime pie in 1983 as a 10-year-old, you couldn't get it in California. It was years before I saw it in California and tried it again. I think I might have even been in college. Okay, so it was probably the 90s, early to mid 90s before key lime pie would become available on a menu in California. Haggis, which is a Scottish, also northern, not just Scotland, but also parts of northern England as well. But basically, you take a sheep's stomach or a cow's stomach, stuff it full of grain and a few other things, whatever you want, mushrooms probably, and then you cook it, and then you eat it. So you're basically eating a stomach that has a bunch of stuff inside of it. I've never done this. I managed to live in England for a year and never tried it. I would try it if I went back, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it as at that point, a fairly recent vegetarian. So it's again one of these starvation foods, is my guess. It's not the type of thing that you would normally eat, but thousands of years ago, someone that was starving did that and did enough of it that they got to like it, or it became a ritual, and so they kept eating it. Tuna eyeballs in Japan. That's exactly what it sounds like, eyeballs from tuna. You don't want to waste them. Iskender kebab, which is, I thought for the longest time that it was named after Alexander the Great, because Iskender was what he was called in Turkey, in that region of the world. No, it wasn't named after Alexander the Great. I was very disappointed to find out. I actually ate this when I visited Western Turkey when I was in college. As it turns out, this one is about the power of local promotion. As it turns out, this guy named Iskender, who was named after Alexander the Great, but he lived more, like 70 years ago, like early 20th century or something like that. He found a dish that enough people liked and was smart enough to get his name on it, and it's still known by that today. And there's an example of this from LA called the French dip sandwich, which comes either from Felipe's or from Cole's in Los Angeles. I personally subscribe to the Felipe's mythology. It sounds more legitimate to me. But it has nothing to do with France. As it turns out, according to the legend, a police officer whose last name was French had ordered a sandwich in the 1920s, and he said, I'm in a hurry, and in their haste to get him the sandwich quickly, they accidentally dropped it in a pan of grease. And he said, oh, don't make me a new one. I'm in such a rush. Just wrap it up and I'll take it with me and eat it. And so he did. And he came back the next day and he said, that was good. Can you dip my sandwich in the gravy again? And they said, sure. And it became a thing. He did it, every single day. Other people started doing it. And now it's a sandwich that you can order all over the world, the French dip sandwich. Conch salad in the Bahamas and other areas in the Caribbean. Taking a conch, which is a seashell with a giant crab-like creature in it, removing that creature and dicing him or her up into a salad. Po' boys, which is a type of sandwich that you find in the deep South, particularly in New Orleans. Sour cream and raisin pie. I can't remember where that one's from, actually. I think it's the upper Midwest somewhere, like Ohio, kind of that region. But, just kind of an interesting, we eat cheesecake in California. We don't eat sour cream and raisin pie. But it does sound very interesting. Cheese curds in Wisconsin and Minnesota, particularly in Wisconsin, but also North Dakota, South Dakota, that whole kind of region up there. That was the very sort of I think it's called the Dairy Belt. Remember, this is where a lot of the dairy farmers that migrated from the Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe ended up living. I've had cheese curds in Wisconsin. They're interesting. Rocky Mountain oysters. Okay, so what Rocky Mountain oyster? If you watched your video, you saw that it is a breaded and fried bull testicle. Okay, most famous now for Denver, but it's more of a regional sort of Great Basin Rocky Mountain delicacy, which is basically to eat deep fried testicles. So some are, I think haggis, tuna eyeballs, conch salad, and Rocky Mountain oysters would be something that most of us probably wouldn't try. I think most of us would be very happy to try a po' boy sandwich, sour cream and raisin pie, key lime pie, and cheese curds. So these localized dishes, sometimes they translate well into a larger eating audience, and in other times, maybe not so much. My friend in Denver, when I visited him, tried to get me to eat Rocky Mountain oysters, and I just said, I'm only here for 2 days. You can keep wasting your time, or we can start hanging out and socializing. I'm not eating a Rocky Mountain oyster. So that's it for region, ethnicity, and globalism. And for week 7,